The rain started around 10, the kind of rain that did not announce itself with thunder or wind, but simply appeared as if the sky had been holding it back all day and finally gave up trying. By 11:30, Route 33 outside Harlow, Ohio had gone the dark and glassy black that made truckers slow down and think twice about the distance between their headlights in the shoulder, and the neon sign above Red Rock Diner had begun its nightly conversation, with the puddles in the parking lot throwing red light across the asphalt in long, shivering streaks that rippled and reformed with each gust off the flat fields to the west. Cassie Callahan was on her third double shift in 5 days. She knew this not because she had counted, but because of the specific weight behind her eyes and the way her right shoulder had started to ache somewhere around the collarbone. A dull, persistent throb she associated with carrying too many plates at angles her body had never quite accepted as natural. She was 22 years old and already had the posture of someone who had spent years learning to take up exactly the amount of space that was permitted, and no more not because she was timid, but because she had grown up in Harlow as Jimmy Callahan's daughter, and the town had specific ideas about what that meant. The town had loved her father in a particular way and had then forgotten him in a particular way, and the combination had shaped the space available to her in ways she had stopped trying to measure or resent. She simply moved through it efficient and observant and more capable than most people gave her credit for, which was something she had decided to treat as an advantage rather than an injury. She tied her apron behind her back at the counter, checked that her order pad was in the front pocket, and pulled her dark auburn hair into a knot at the base of her neck. The small leather bracelet on her left wrist caught the light as she moved dark and worn smooth along the inner edge, where the stitching had been reinforced twice over the years, once by her own hand with a needle and thread from the diner's sewing kit. In a careful late-night moment, she now understood differently than as she had understood it at the time. She adjusted it without thinking the way a person adjusts something they have worn so long. It has ceased to feel like an addition and become simply part of the body. The bracelet had belonged to her father. She did not consciously think about that every time she touched it. She had stopped thinking about it consciously around the time she turned 19, the same year she had stopped consciously thinking about the sound of his boots on the porch steps. The smell of motor oil and black coffee that clung to his leather could after a long day in the shop. The particular way he laughed at things that were not especially funny just because he genuinely liked the sound of laughter in a room. These things had settled below the level of thought now into the place where a person keeps what cannot be afforded to look at directly during an ordinary Tuesday night shift, when there are coffees to pour and orders to run, and the highway outside is full of tired people who need a clean-lit place to stop. Red Rock Diner had sat at the junction of Route 33 and Callaway Road since 1962, and in that time it had developed the particular character of places that survive long enough to become essential to the geography of people's lives. The floors were black and white tile worn to a pleasant, smooth scuff at the counter stools. The booths were red vinyl patched in 3 places with electrical tape that had been there so long it felt deliberately vintage. The pie case beside the register was lit from within like a small, devoted cathedral, displaying the daily offerings with appropriate reverence, and the neon signs in the windows advertised brands that no longer existed, but had been there long enough that removing them would have felt like removing history. The coffee was strong enough to make your back teeth ache, and it was always at the correct temperature, because Cassie had decided early in her tenure that the temperature of the coffee was one of the few things entirely within her control, and she intended to exercise that control consistently regardless of what else was happening in the room. There were nights when the work felt genuinely satisfying in a way she could not have explained to anyone who had not done it. The diner had its own internal economy, its own unspoken rules and hierarchies and rhythms, and she had mastered those systems to the point where moving through them felt less like effort and more like fluency. She knew which truckers wanted their coffee topped without being asked, and which ones needed 2 minutes before they were ready to order. She knew the dairy farm couple shared a single piece of pie on Friday nights and never ordered a second cup. She knew the older man who came alone on Thursdays was lonely in a specific way that a brief, genuine conversation about something ordinary could help. These were not things anyone had taught her. They were things she had learned because she paid attention, which was a habit her father had installed in her without framing it as instruction. Pay attention, he had told her once when she was 9 years old, sitting behind him on his motorcycle in the empty parking lot of a closed grocery store, on a Sunday morning while he drove slow circles and taught her the physics of leaning. Not just to what you are doing, to everything around you at the same time. Your peripheral vision is as important as your direct vision. More important sometimes. She had thought he meant motorcycles. She had come to understand he meant everything. Lena Cross was behind the counter when Cassie came in from the back parking lot shaking rain from her jacket. Lena was 24 and possessed the particular quality of being genuinely cheerful at 11 o'clock at night, which was either a natural gift or a form of psychological armor that had become indistinguishable from the authentic thing through years of sustained practice. And Cassie had long since decided it did not matter which it was, as long as it kept the atmosphere from curdling on the slow nights when the highway outside went quiet and the only sounds were the pie case humming and the radio playing something nobody had specifically chosen. They had worked together for 3 years and had arrived at the particular understanding of people who spend significant time in a confined space under mild but continuous pressure. It was not friendship exactly, or not only friendship. It was something more structural than that, a mutual comprehension that did not require regular articulation. Lena knew how Cassie took her coffee and what she would talk about easily and what she would redirect. Cassie knew the same about Lena. They had arrived at this knowledge without ever sitting down to deliberately acquire it, which was perhaps its own kind of intimacy. Bad one coming, Lena said without looking up from the sugar caddies she was refilling, her hands moving through the familiar task with the automatic precision of someone who has done the same thing hundreds of times. How bad? Cassie said, hanging her jacket on the hook beside the back door. Dale Mercer's driver called ahead. He will be here around midnight. Cassie stopped midway through tying her second apron knot. She made herself complete the knot before responding because rushing reactions was a thing she had been working against since she was a teenager and understood that her instincts occasionally moved faster than the situation required. Did he say what for? Lena looked up. Just dinner, apparently, the usual. Booth by the window. She paused with the kind of pause that had a question in it. Cassie Marcus could cover if you wanted to step out. I can handle the floor. I am not going anywhere, Cassie said. She meant both things at once, the immediate and the larger, and both were true in the same way they had been true for 7 years. She had reasons to stay in Harlow that she had never been able to articulate cleanly to anyone who had not grown up in the specific shadow of a man the town had respected and mourned, and then quietly filed away as history. Her mother was the practical anchor, but the practical anchor was not the whole story. She stayed because leaving felt like a completion. She was not ready to accept some final closing of a chapter that she understood on some level she had never examined too directly was not yet closed. The rain intensified at 11:45. 2 truckers came through the door, shaking water from their caps, taking counterstools with the relieved heaviness of men who had been driving too long in weather too heavy and were grateful for the specific comfort of a diner that smelled like coffee and had adequate lighting and did not require them to be anything other than tired and hungry. Cassie poured without being asked, read their body language accurately, and gave them a few minutes before she approached with her pad. She moved through the shift the way she always moved, efficient and quiet and present in exactly the way the work required, attentive to the room, without imposing on any individual corner of it. She was halfway through the trucker's second coffees when the black SUV turned into the lot. It came through the rain, with its headlights cutting wide arcs across the wet asphalt, parking in the spot nearest the entrance, with the ease of a vehicle whose driver understood that proximity was a privilege that could simply be taken. She watched Dale Mercer step down from the passenger side while his driver materialized with an umbrella, watched him straighten his jacket with the automatic precision of a man whose relationship with his own presentation was long settled, watched him look at the diner through the glass with the expression she had come to know over 4 years of his patronage, the expression of a man assessing something he already understood but found it useful to continue assessing. He was 52 years old, lean, and carefully maintained with silver at the temples that had arrived at exactly the right time to read as distinguished rather than aging, and the kind of uniform, even tan, that came from managed exposure rather than outdoor work. He wore a dark jacket over a collared shirt and moved through the diner door with the ease of someone who had spent his entire adult life ensuring he was never made to feel unwelcome anywhere. because he had understood early that the power to never feel unwelcome required specific and sustained effort, and had made that effort consistently for 30 years. He smiled when he saw Cassie. It was a good smile, practiced until it read as natural warm, without being intimate, the smile of a man who had understood that charm was a tool of the first order and had refined his use of it. "Good evening," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "your booth is ready." She led him to the window booth, set down the menu he would not consult, because he always ordered the same thing and poured water without waiting to be asked. He settled in with the unhurried ease of a man at home in any room, and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with the expression she had never been able to name with complete precision. Something between appreciation and quiet calculation, as if she were an asset whose value he liked to periodically confirm remained stable. "Your mother doing all right?" he asked. The phrasing never varied. Gentle, deliberate, dropped into the conversation with the practiced casualness of a man who wanted people to feel his interest was personal rather than strategic. "She is the same," Cassie said. "Comfortable, though. The facility's good." "It is fine," Cassie said. He was paying for it. Had been for 4 years since Ruth Callahan's neurological condition had progressed to the point where Cassie's income from the diner and the available state assistance were insufficient, and Dale Mercer had appeared one evening with an offer framed as simple generosity and delivered with the kind of practiced warmth that made refusal feel ungrateful rather than reasonable. The arrangement had no explicit conditions that she had ever been able to identify. That was what had always made it sit wrong in her chest, in the quiet, specific way of a draft in a room you cannot afford to repair. An arrangement with no stated conditions was simply an arrangement with conditions that had not yet been invoked. She brought his food when it was ready, refilled his coffee at the appropriate intervals, and was in the middle of processing a card for the truckers when she became aware, without looking directly, that Dale Mercer was standing at the register instead of in his booth. She set down the card terminal. He was looking at her wrist. "Can I help you?" she said. He raised his eyes to her face, and they were flatter than his usual expression, as if the layer of warmth had been set aside for the moment, because the moment did not require it. "That bracelet," he said. His voice was the same pleasant, measured instrument it always was, but there was something underneath the words that had an edge to it, the quality of a well-made piece of furniture whose structural element you cannot see, but that determines whether the whole thing holds. "Where did you get that?" "It was my father's." "I know it was," he said. He paused in the way he did when he was selecting words to make himself appear more reasonable than the thing he was about to say. "It actually belongs to me. It was placed with your father as a custodial arrangement, and I have been meaning to address it. I would like it back." He looked at her with the expression of a man presenting a simple resolution to a minor misunderstanding. "I would be very fair about compensation. Name a number and I will double it." "It belonged to my father," she said. "He left it to me." Mercer nodded slowly, absorbing her response as anticipated, as if it were the next step in a conversation he had already mapped completely. "I understand that is how it feels. I am not asking you to feel differently about it. I am asking you to return something that was always supposed to come back." He softened his voice by a precise, controlled degree. "Think about it, Cassie. There is no reason for this to be anything complicated." "I am going to need you to return to your booth," she said. Something crossed his face. It was quick and carefully managed, and gone before a person who was not watching closely would have registered it. The expression of a man who has encountered an obstacle where he expected a clear path and is deciding in real time how to proceed. "Of course," he said, "but think about it." He went back to his booth. He finished his meal at his own unhurried pace. He left the generous tip he always left placed flat under the edge of the plate rather than on top of it, a small distinction she had always registered without previously understanding what it signified. He walked out into the rain without looking back at her. His driver was ready with the umbrella. The SUV pulled out of the lot with the smooth, quiet precision of something expensive and well-maintained and disappeared down Route 33 into the rain. Cassie stood at the register with the tip in her hand. She thought about the way he had used her first name at the end. Cassie. Not Miss Callahan, not the formal address a man of his standing and age used with a young woman he was not personally close to. Her first name deployed with the ease of a man who had already decided he was on familiar terms with things that were not his. She put the tip in her apron pocket and cleared his booth, and did not say anything to Lena, because there was nothing yet that had the shape of a complete thought. At 12:50, when the truckers had paid and the diner had settled into its quiet final hour with the rain on the windows and the pie case humming and the radio low, the bell above the door rang and Hank Dolan walked in. He was wearing his chapter cut over a flannel shirt that had been laundered so many times it had gone soft and indeterminate in color. His gray beard damp at the edges from the rain, and he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had made peace with the fact that slowness communicated something that rushing never could. He did not look around the room when he entered. He went directly to the stool at the far end of the counter, the one nearest the wall and farthest from the window, and lowered himself onto it with the heaviness of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is about to finally set it down. Cassie poured his coffee without asking because she had been doing it since she was 12 years old, and helping on weekend mornings when her father brought her along to the diner, the way some fathers brought their children to the shop or the field or wherever the work happened. He was here tonight, she said. I know, Hank said. He wrapped both hands around the mug in the way she associated with him having something difficult to say. His hands were large and scarred across the knuckles and had the particular look of hands that had done a great deal of mechanical work over a great many years and wore the record of it permanently. I was in the lot for the second half of his visit. He looked at her wrist. He asked about it. He said it belonged to him, she said. Hank looked at her. His eyes had the quality she had always associated with her father's eyes, not in color, but in the thing they did, the specific quality of a man who had decided long ago that looking away was a choice rather than a reflex, and had stopped making that choice. Cassie, he said, and his voice had dropped to the particular register he used when something mattered. Your father did not give you that bracelet only because he loved you. He loved you more than he had words for, that is the truth. But that was not the only reason. Lena had stopped moving at the far end of the counter. The pie case hummed its steady note. The rain tapped at the windows in its uneven rhythm, almost conversational. The week before he died, Hank said Jimmy came to see me. Not at the chapter hall, and not at any of the usual places. At my house on a Tuesday evening, in the dark, which he had not done in years. He rode out and sat at my kitchen table and drank 2 cups of coffee, and he was not relaxed the way he was usually relaxed when he came to see me. He had a focused quality about him, the quality he got when something had finally become clear after a long time of working toward clarity. He told me he had found something he had not expected to find. He had been going to the county records office several times over several months. He had been looking at the property transfer documentation on the Marker Road land. My grandfather's land, Cassie said. Earl Callahan's land, Hank said carefully. The 38 acres that transferred out of the family in 1989 in the months following what everyone at the time called a farming accident. The land that became, through a series of subsequent transactions over several years, the ground floor of Mercer Development's first commercial project in Harlow County. She had known about Marker Road the way you know about family history when you have grown up surrounded by grief rather than information. Her grandfather Earl had died before she was born. The land had been gone before she was born. Her father had mentioned it occasionally, not with bitterness exactly, but with the flat quality of a settled fact, the way people mention things they have accepted because the tools for doing otherwise were never available to them. What did he find, she asked. Hank set his mug down carefully. He found that Earl Callahan's death was not an accident. He found documentation suggesting that Earl had refused to sell the Marker Road land when it was requested of him through a series of intermediaries, and that when financial and legal pressure had failed to move him, other methods were employed. He found that those methods had required the cooperation of specific individuals in specific county positions, and that those individuals had been compensated through channels that appeared in no public record. He found that the same mechanism had been used at least twice more in Harlow County over the following decade, each time to facilitate a property acquisition by someone connected to the same central figure. He looked at her steadily, a man who was a young developer in 1989, just beginning to build what would become the most substantial real estate portfolio in this county, and who could not afford for the origins of that portfolio to be examined closely. Cassie held his gaze. He gave me the bracelet that Tuesday night, Hank continued. He said he had put something inside it. He said he was not certain anything would happen to him, but he had been careful enough in his life to know the difference between probability and certainty, and he needed to be certain that what he had found would survive him if it came to that. He paused. He said he needed someone to make sure you found it when you were old enough to know what to do with it. Those were his exact words. Old enough to know what to do with it. I have been asking myself when that moment was for 7 years. Tonight, with Mercer coming in here and asking for it by name, I think the answer is now. Cassie looked at the bracelet on her wrist. She had worn it every day for 7 years and had never considered that it could be opened, had taken the reinforced stitching along the inner edge as evidence of nothing more than accumulated repair. She thought about the moment 2 winters ago when she had sat in the back kitchen with a needle and thread from the diner's kit and carefully restitched that exact seam, not knowing what she was protecting, and the full weight of that understanding moved through her slowly and completely. She reached beneath the counter for the small scissors in the prep drawer. She turned the bracelet over to the inner edge and began to cut carefully, one thread at a time, the way her father had once shown her how to take something apart when you needed it to remain useful afterward. You go slow, he had said. You pay attention to both the thing you are doing and the thing you are doing it to. You do not force anything, because forcing things is how you destroy what they were holding. The seam opened along 6 inches of the inner band. Inside, wrapped in dark oilskin, folded twice and pressed flat, was a USB drive no larger than her thumbnail. It was black and had no markings. Wrapped around it and held with a thin strip of the same leather as the bracelet cut to the width of 2 fingers was a message punched into the leather in the hand stamp method her father had used on everything he made, each letter pressed in with a metal stamp, imperfect and deliberate and entirely his. For when they come. Lena had drifted to the near end of the counter without Cassie noticing the movement. She stood with her arms loosely folded and looked at the USB and then at Cassie, and her expression had the careful stillness of someone who has just understood the shape of something and is giving it the silence it deserves. Cassie looked at Hank. Her 100 questions organized themselves without her effort into the one that mattered most tonight. Dale Mercer, she said. Hank's jaw moved once. His hands were flat on the counter. He gave one slow nod, the kind that comes from the weight of certainty rather than from agreement. The bell above the door rang. Cassie closed her hand around the USB and the oilskin in one continuous smooth motion, the way her body moved in moments when her mind had not yet fully decided whether to be afraid and was choosing the practical present by default. She turned. Sheriff Tom Briggs stood in the doorway with rain on the brim of his hat and the flat, careful expression of a man who has committed to doing something he is not entirely comfortable doing and has resolved his discomfort by arriving before the hesitation could solidify. He was 55 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had once been open in the way of men who believe in institutions and had gradually closed over the years the way a field closes over when nothing is planted in it season after season. He had known Cassie since she was born. He had been the deputy who told her and her mother what had happened on Route 9 on that October night 7 years ago. He looked at her wrist before he looked at her face. Then he looked at the counter between her hands at the bracelet lying there with its seam cut open. Evening, Cassie, he said. His voice was level in the way that required maintenance. Hank, he brought his gaze up to hers carefully. I am going to need you to come down to the station with me. There has been a complaint filed regarding property, and I need to ask you a few questions. Hank stood from his stool with deliberate slowness, keeping his hands visible with the practiced control of a man who knew the precise location of every line. Tom, he said quietly, she just finished back-to-back doubles. This will not take long, Briggs said. He was still looking at the bracelet on the counter. She understood the geometry of the situation. Dale Mercer had not gone home and let the matter rest. He had been on the phone before the SUV cleared the parking lot, or perhaps while it was still idling, and the call had been answered within 45 minutes by someone whose number he had dialed, before whose answer he had known was coming, who had arrived wearing a badge and a carefully neutral expression. Lena was behind her. She felt it before she registered it consciously, the slight shift in the air that preceded contact. And then Lena's hand closing around hers, for half a second, 2 fingers pressing deliberately against her palm, and then the small, hard shape of the USB was gone from her hand and in Lena's transferred between them, with the efficiency of someone who had spent years moving things through a crowded kitchen at impractical angles and had developed an economy of motion that was its own form of competence. Cassie let Briggs see her empty hands. She let him see the bracelet on the counter open, and empty it seemed cut its oilskin visible and empty. She let him see that she had nothing to conceal because the only thing worth concealing was already in the pocket of Lena's apron in a place Briggs was not going to look. All right, she said, let me get my jacket. She went to the back and put her jacket on and stood in the kitchen for 3 seconds with her eyes closed. She thought about her father riding out on a Tuesday evening to sit in his oldest friend's kitchen with something he had found that he had not expected to find. She thought about the care he had taken in building what he had built, the patience of it, the specific trust he had placed in specific people with specific pieces of the whole. She thought about the 3 words punched into the leather strip and understood them now, not as a warning but as a preparation, the act of a man who had looked ahead clearly and made arrangements accordingly. She walked back out and followed Tom Briggs into the rain without hesitation and without looking back, because looking back was not something her father had ever needed to do, and she had no reason to begin. Hank watched the patrol car pull out of the lot. He sat on the stool for a long moment, both hands flat on the counter, his coffee cooling in front of him. Then he looked at Lena. She had her right hand resting over her apron pocket. "Is it safe?" he said. "Very safe," Lena said. Hank nodded and picked up his phone. The drive to the Harlow County Sheriff's Department took 11 minutes on county roads in the rain. Cassie sat in the back of the patrol car and watched the wet surface of the road unspooling behind them through the rear window and organized what she knew with the particular methodical focus she used when she needed her mind to work efficiently without letting the emotional weight of what she was working through interfere with the quality of the work. Her grandfather, Earl Callahan, had died in 1989 in what the county record described as a farming accident. He had been 57, experienced, healthy, and had been working that land for decades. He had died without witnesses. The land had transferred out of the Callahan family in the months that followed under circumstances her father had apparently found to contain documented irregularities, specifically involving notarization that should not have been legally possible given the status of the property at the time of the transfer. Her father had found that the irregularities had been arranged, that their arrangement had required the cooperation of individuals in county positions, and that those individuals had been compensated through channels that appeared in no public record. He had found that the same mechanism had been deployed at least twice more in the county over the following decade. The man who had profited from these arrangements had gone on to become the most powerful developer in Harlow County. He had built his reputation on a foundation that required the story of its own origins to remain buried. He had been paying for Ruth Callahan's care for 4 years, keeping the daughter of the man who had documented those origins close enough to observe and far enough from resources to be dangerous. Cassie looked at the road behind her and kept her face neutral for the rearview mirror. The station was quiet at 1 in the morning. Briggs put her in a room with a table and 2 chairs and a mounted camera and left her with a paper cup of water and the particular silence that is designed to communicate something without the communicator having to take responsibility for it. She sat with her hands flat on the table and gave the camera nothing useful to read. Briggs came back 20 minutes later. He had been on the phone. She knew this from the quality of the air in the room when he came in the slightly changed energy of a man who has just received instructions and is in the process of following them. He sat across from her and placed a manila folder on the table without opening it. He said there is a complaint alleging that property belonging to Dale Mercer was removed without his authorization. The bracelet in question. His claim is that it was held by your father as a temporary custodial arrangement and that legal ownership remained with him throughout. My father is dead, Cassie said. I know that. His voice was steady in the careful way of a man delivering something he has been told to deliver. I am asking you to surrender the bracelet voluntarily as evidence in the proceeding. It would simplify the situation considerably. She looked at him across the table for a moment. She tried to read in his expression how deep the arrangement went, whether it was fear or obligation or money, or all 3, whether he was a man who had made one specific decision years ago and had been managing its consequences ever since, or a man who had continued making variations of the same decision across 7 years. His face was closed in the way of long practice, which told her this was not a new arrangement and was not casual. She reached up and unclasped the bracelet and set it on the table between them. It lay there on the scarred surface empty, its seam cut, its contents already gone to a safer place, and she watched Briggs look at it and watch the small, specific relaxation that moved through his shoulders, the unconscious physical response of a man whose primary concern has been addressed. He had been sent to recover what was inside the bracelet, and the bracelet was empty, and he was calculating what that meant, whether the USB had already been used or had been disposed of, or had been transferred, and in the time it would take him to calculate through to the right answer, she would already be gone from this room. He put the bracelet in an evidence bag and sealed it and wrote the label. "You are free to go," he said. She stood and put on her jacket and paused at the door with one hand on the frame. The gesture was her father's. She had not decided to make it. It arrived with the same naturalness as any learned habit. "Tom," she said. He looked up from the bag. "My father always spoke well of you." She left the sentence exactly where it was and walked out through the station and into the wet early morning air. The rain had thinned to mist. The streets were empty. She began walking toward Route 33 with her hands in her jacket pockets and her shoulders level and her eyes on the road ahead the way her father had taught her to walk any road she was not certain about. "Walk like you have already decided where you are going," he had said. "Walk like you already know you are going to get there. Because when people who are watching see that quality in how you move, they respond to it, and sometimes that response is the only protection you have." Her phone buzzed at the second block. Lena had written, "USB is safe in my pocket. Hank is already on the phone with someone in Columbus. Also, your mom called the diner about 10 minutes ago. The night nurse let her use the station phone. She said it was a family matter." She sounded very clear, Cassie, like a really clear night. Cassie stood under a streetlight in the mist and read the message twice. Her mother's clarity came and went on its own schedule, arriving and departing without warning, and Cassie had learned over 4 years of watching this to receive the clear periods without grasping them, to be fully present in them, without building structures on them that would collapse when the clarity withdrew. When it arrived, it was her mother, completely the woman who had kept house on $200 and a sense of humor and had taught Cassie to drive a stick shift in an empty church parking lot on Sunday morning and had read to her every night until she was old enough to be embarrassed by it and then kept reading to her for another year anyway. She dialed the facility. The night desk transferred her to room 14, and after 2 rings, her mother picked up, and the voice that came through was entirely present, clear and alert, and specifically herself. "Mom," Cassie said. "I have been keeping something too long," Ruth said. Her voice had the careful quality of someone navigating between what they know and the fear of losing it before it can be passed on. "I remembered tonight, and then I was afraid I would lose it again before I could reach you, so I asked to use the phone." She paused. "2 men from Mercer Development called the facility director this evening. They are coming tomorrow morning to review the care arrangement." Ruth paused again. "And Cassie, your father left something here. He told me about it before the accident. He told me that if anything happened to him and Mercer's people ever came asking about his business, I should contact you and Hank immediately. He said I would know when the time was because they would be moving and I would feel it." Cassie stopped walking. She stood on the sidewalk with one hand pressed lightly against her sternum, feeling her own heartbeat, feeling the specific quality of a plan that had been in motion for 7 years, arriving at the moment it had been built for. "I will be there tonight," she said. "I am bringing Hank. Do not speak to anyone from Mercer Development before we arrive. If anyone from the facility calls about the arrangement tonight, tell them you need your daughter present for any conversations about financial matters." "You sound like him," her mother said, when he had made up his mind about something. Cassie said, "I know." She dialed Hank and told him what her mother had said, and he listened without interrupting and said, "I am 20 minutes from the diner. Come around the back and wait. Do not go to the front of the building." Hank's truck was in the back lot in 4 minutes, running quiet with the headlights off. Cassie got in. He handed her the thermos without speaking, which was the right thing, and pulled out onto Callaway Road, heading north on county roads, rather than Route 33, taking the longer route the way he always moved when he wanted to arrive somewhere without being noted along the way. They drove north through the dark, flat fields with the mist coming and going across the headlights, and the radio off and the thermos passing between them. After a while, Cassie said, "Tell me what was in the documents beyond what you told me at the counter." Hank said, "Your father was thorough in a way I have never seen matched in a person who was not formally trained for it. He did not only document what he suspected, he documented the mechanism. He found the original transfer documents for the Marker Road land, and identified the specific notarization that had been falsified, which is to say that the individual who certified the transfer had neither the authority nor the legitimate basis to certify it and had been paid to do so anyway. He found that same notary signature on two other property transactions in Harlow County over the following 8 years, both of which had involved the disappearance or death of the previous owner before the transfer was completed. He found financial records connecting Dale Mercer to those transactions through a chain of intermediary accounts. And he found something else. Cassie turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. He found a recording, Hank said. He had been recording conversations whenever he could during those 3 months. He was careful about it. He managed to record one conversation between Dale Mercer and another man discussing the Marker Road situation and what needed to happen to ensure things were resolved cleanly. He paused. The other man on that recording is Tom Briggs. Cassie looked at the road ahead of them. Briggs was a deputy then, Hank said. He was offered $40,000 to manage the investigation after and to ensure that certain records requests by your father were handled in a way that did not result in useful information. He accepted. He said on the recording that it would be the last time. He looked at the road. It was not the last time. Did my father know before the accident? Cassie asked. Hank was quiet for a long moment. He knew Briggs had been paid in that specific instance. He did not know how deeply Briggs was embedded in the arrangement or for how long. He told me that Tuesday night in my kitchen that he had made one mistake in his caution, that he had shared one piece of what he knew with Briggs before he understood what Briggs was. He thought he could reach him. He believed that most people had a line past which they would choose the right thing if given the opportunity to choose it. He was wrong about Briggs. He was wrong about that one thing Hank said. He was right about everything else. The Meadowbrook Care Facility sat back from County Road 7 behind a line of maples that had been planted with care and had grown into graceful shapes over the years, their bare November silhouettes against the overcast sky, giving the approach a particular quality of muted dignity. The motion sensor floods in the parking lot lit the approach with the practical, even brightness of a place that needed to function at any hour, and a night attendant behind the lobby glass buzzed them through without ceremony when Hank held up his identification. Ruth Callahan was sitting upright in bed in room 14 when Cassie came through the door. She was wearing a blue cardigan over her hospital gown, and her hands were folded in her lap around a sealed envelope that she was holding with the focused, deliberate attention of someone who has been keeping watch over something important and is relieved to finally be in the presence of the right person to give it to. She looked at Cassie with clear eyes, fully present, the complete version of herself that arrived without schedule and departed the same way. I was hoping you would come together, her mother said, looking from Cassie to Hank, where he stood near the door. Cassie sat on the edge of the bed. Ruth looked at the envelope in her hands and then up at her daughter. Your father came to see me on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks before the accident, she said. He was not casual about it. He came in the afternoon when he was usually busy, sat at the kitchen table and had one cup of coffee, and then he took this out of his jacket pocket and set it on the table between us. He told me he needed me to hold it. He said that if something happened to him, I should give it to you when you were old enough to understand it. He said I would know when that was because you would be scared and still moving forward anyway. She looked directly at her daughter. Are you scared? Yes, Cassie said. Are you still moving forward? Yes. Ruth pressed the envelope into her hands. Hank stepped forward from the door and produced a second envelope from his inside jacket pocket. It was older, its paper slightly yellowed, sealed with tape that had dried to barely holding. He set it on the blanket beside the first one without ceremony and stepped back to give them room. There is that too, he said quietly. He wanted you to have both. Cassie opened her mother's envelope first. The letter inside was a single page in her father's handwriting, which was slightly cramped and completely legible. The handwriting of a man who had learned to write by persistence and had made it reliable, and then his own. The date at the top was September 28th, 2017, 12 days before he died on Route 9. If you are reading this, the thing I was afraid might happen probably happened, he had written. I want you to know first that I am not sorry for finding what I found, and I am not sorry for deciding to do something about it. I am only sorry if what I did to address it cost you something you should not have had to pay. Your grandfather Earl did not die in a farming accident. He was removed from his land because he refused to sell it to people who needed it, and the people who needed it arranged his removal through methods that required the cooperation of individuals in specific positions. What happened to me later is the same pattern one generation forward, because the man who built his first project on that land cannot afford for anyone with the right evidence to examine what the foundation of everything he has built actually is. I have documented what I found and placed it in the only location I could trust completely. You have been wearing it since you were 15 years old. Open it when they come for it, and they will come for it eventually. What is inside will be enough if you get it to the right people. The right people are not in Harlow County. They are not Tom Briggs. Call the Ohio Attorney General's office and ask for the Property Fraud Division, and ask specifically for a woman named Sandra Kraft. I met her at a county land use meeting in 2014. She asked better questions than anyone else in the room, and she looked directly at the people she spoke to, which is less common among people in official positions than it should be. I believe she is honest. That belief is based on limited evidence, but I have found that accurate first impressions based on genuine attention are more reliable than they are given credit for being. I love you, Cassie. You are the most capable person I have ever had the privilege of knowing. Capable does not mean alone. Do not do this alone. Your father. She read it twice and sat with it for a moment, aware of her own breathing and of her mother's warmth beside her, and of Hank near the door, and of all the ordinary sounds of the night around her, each of them separate and present and real. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. She opened Hank's envelope. This one was 3 pages written across what appeared to be multiple sessions given the varying weight of the pen. It was addressed to Hank and contained specific instructions organized in her father's particular way when he was being fully serious: names, dates, account numbers. The name Sandra Kraft with a note beside it reading, "She is honest because she is genuinely curious," which is the most reliable kind. A property address on Marker Road with specific location details. The North Oak stand, the tree with the split trunk at 4 feet the right fork, the base of the split, a waterproof case. And near the end of the 3rd page, tell Cassie she already knows how to do the hard part. She has always known. She just does not know she knows it yet. Ruth had been watching her read with the clear-eyed patience of a woman who had waited a long time to be useful in this specific way and was glad to have arrived at the moment. She said, "Your father talked about you constantly when he was working through all of this. He was not worried about whether you were capable. He was worried about what it would cost you. He said the cost was the only thing that gave him pause." He was right that it would cost something, Cassie said. Her mother said he was right about most things. He was wrong about one of them, and you know which one. Cassie held her mother's hand for a moment. Then she looked at Hank. "2 men from Mercer Development are coming in the morning to review the care arrangement," she said. Hank said, "I know." He held up his phone. "I have been recording since we walked through the lobby." She had not needed to ask him to. She stood and kissed her mother's forehead. Ruth said, "Your father used to say that the problem with Harlow was that nobody ever did the important things in front of witnesses." "I know," Cassie said. "He also said the solution was to bring your own witnesses with you." Hank said, "Your mother is exactly right." They drove toward Columbus on the interstate with the windows cracked slightly and the coffee thermos passing between them and the radio off because neither of them needed it. The mist was entirely gone, and the highway was open and well lit and nearly empty in the particular way of interstates in the hours before the world fully wakes, as if the road had briefly become a private corridor reserved for people with specific business. 40 minutes out, Hank's phone rang. He checked the screen and his expression changed in the way that meant something unexpected. He answered and listened for 30 seconds and said 3 quiet words and hung up. "Walt Greer," he said. The name meant nothing to her. He was a truck driver out of a freight company in Marysville. He left Harlow in October 2017, the month after your father died, and has been living in Dayton under a different name since then. He called the chapter number tonight and asked to speak to someone about Jimmy Callahan. Cassie felt the cold move through her, the specific cold of recognition, rather than fear, the physical sensation of a picture shifting from blur into focus. "He was driving the truck," she said. "We do not know that for certain yet, but you think so." Hank was quiet with the road for a moment. "Your father's documentation mentioned a name connected to the financial arrangement for the night of the accident, an account that received 2 payments, one approximately a week before the date and one 2 days after. The name on the account was a slight variation of the name he just gave on the phone, close enough that I recognized it when he called. He did not choose to drive into my father on his own. No, Hank said. He was paid to do it. And then he was frightened enough of the person who paid him and frightened enough of what he had done to run, and he has been gone for 7 years. And now Dale Mercer is moving, and a man who has been living quietly under a different name understands what that movement is likely to mean for him. He wants to be a witness before he becomes a loose end, Cassie said. That is my assessment, Hank said. She looked at the highway ahead of them, at the lights of Columbus building in the distance, and thought about her father writing, "Do not do this alone," and meaning it completely. She thought about everything that was moving tonight because one man had been patient and careful and had trusted the right people with the right pieces. She dialed the direct line for the Ohio Attorney General's Property Fraud Division, which she had looked up on her phone during the drive. It rang 8 times. A voice answered that was alert in the specific way of someone who has been awake at this hour before and comes to full attention without effort. "This is Sandra Kraft. My name is Cassie Callahan," Cassie said. "My father was Jimmy Callahan. He told me you were the right person to call when the time came." He used those exact words. There was a brief silence, the kind that belongs to someone retrieving something from memory. Then Sandra Kraft said, "I remember your father. He came to a county land use meeting in 2014. He asked better questions than every developer in the room combined. He said you looked directly at the people you spoke to. He was perceptive about people," Sandra Kraft said. "Where are you and what do you have?" Cassie told her everything. She spoke in the order that made the most coherent case, rather than the chronological order of how she had come to know it, because that was what the situation required. The USB, the emails and financial documentation and audio recording. It contained the letter, the property deed, the buried case on Marker Road, Walt Greer in Dayton, who was prepared to give a full statement, the morning visit to the care facility, already arranged by Mercer Development, the bracelet now in evidence custody and empty. Sandra Kraft listened without interrupting. When Cassie finished, she said, "Get to the Columbus field office. I will have a team there by 5:30. Do not transmit any of this digitally. Do not stop anywhere between here and the city. Bring whoever you trust most and bring the witness when you have him." She paused briefly. "Your father built something very careful. Do not let it fall apart in the last mile." Cassie said, "I am Jimmy Callahan's daughter. Falling apart in the last mile is not something we do." She heard the beginning of something in Sandra Kraft's voice that might have been a brief smile. "I know," she said. "He told me that himself. Drive carefully." They arrived in Dayton at 3:45 in a trailer park on the east side of the city, where the paths between units were well-maintained gravel, and the small patches of ground in front of each unit had the particular tidiness of people for whom pride was one of the few things that remained fully within their own control. Walt Greer's unit was at the end of the third row, marked by a wind chime made from salvaged hardware pieces and a pot of geraniums on the front step that had survived the season through evidence of sustained effort. The light inside was already on. Hank knocked and the door opened almost immediately, as if the man on the other side had been standing close to it for some time. Walt Greer was 61 years old and had the look of a man who had spent 7 years assigning himself a penance that no institution had formally prescribed, continuing it in the absence of any external structure, because the internal pressure of it never released. He was lean in the way of someone whose appetite had been affected by something that was not physical, with deep lines beside his eyes, and the careful, precise movements of someone who had learned not to make sudden gestures in the presence of people he did not know well. He looked at Cassie, and then at Hank, and then back at Cassie, and what his face did when he saw her was something she had not seen on a stranger's face before. "You look just like him," he said. His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. She stood in the doorway and said nothing and waited for him to decide what came next. He stepped back. The inside of the trailer was clean, with the intentional cleanliness of someone for whom maintaining order had become a form of discipline in the absence of other forms. A kitchen table with 2 chairs, a couch with a folded blanket, a shelf of paperback novels organized by height. A framed photograph on the wall that she guessed depicted someone else's family, kept as a record of something owed or lost or hoped for. She did not ask about it. He sat at the table and folded his hands on the surface and looked at them. "I need to tell you what happened," he said. Before I say any of it officially, I need you to hear it first. Cassie sat across from him. Hank stood near the door. Walt Greer said I had been out of regular work for 8 months when Mercer's people reached me. I had a family at the time, 3 kids, a wife working 2 jobs to keep things together. They offered $12,000 to drive a specific route on a specific night and allow my vehicle to drift into a specific lane at a specific time. The language they used was very careful about what would happen. They said significant disruption. They said the rider would understand the message and no one would be seriously hurt. He paused with the controlled stillness of a man who has recited a rationalization so many times it has become its own kind of prison, still present but no longer believed. I told myself things that made the action feel survivable, when it happened differently than I had told myself it would. I stopped and I called it in, and then I drove away, because the fear of what I had done and the fear of the person who had arranged it were both larger than anything else I could feel. He looked at his folded hands. I have thought about your father every day for 7 years. I say that not as a way of asking you for anything. I say it because it is true and because you deserve to hear one true thing from me before anything else. He looked up at her. I am not going to tell you I am a good person. I am not. I made a choice for money that killed someone, and I have been living in the consequences of that choice ever since. But I am done running. He paused. Dale Mercer is moving again. I have been monitoring for his name for years, and this week I saw indicators that told me he was preparing to manage loose ends. I am a loose end. I would rather be a witness than be managed. Will you say all of that on the record, Cassie asked. Everything I just told you and more, he said. Every conversation I had with his people before and after. Every detail I remember. He held her gaze. I know what I did. I know what it cost. The only thing I can do that has any value now is make certain that what I know reaches the right place before someone ensures that it does not. We are going to Columbus, Cassie said. The Attorney General's field office. There will be people there by 5:30. Can you be ready to travel? Walt looked around the trailer. He stood up without hesitating. I have been ready for 7 years, he said. Sandra Kraft met them at the Columbus field office at 6:40 before the regular staff arrived in a conference room with 2 recorders on the table and 2 colleagues already present when they walked in, one from the property fraud division and one she introduced as a federal liaison without elaborating on the specific agency. She was compact and precise and moved with the efficiency of someone who ran meetings that accomplished their stated purpose within the time allotted, and she shook Cassie's hand and held it for a moment longer than a standard handshake. Your father was right about you, she said. You did not know me, Cassie said. He described you well enough, Sandra said, and the simplicity of it was its own form of tribute. Cassie produced the USB from where Lena had handed it back to her at the diner before they left for Dayton. The federal liaison handled it with evidence gloves and logged it into a formal chain of custody record with the language that her father had apparently understood would be required, which was why he had wrapped it in oilskin and sealed it in leather and placed it on his daughter's wrist, so that when the time came, there would be an unbroken documented line from the night he assembled it to the morning it was received. Walt Greer gave his statement. He spoke for 90 minutes without stopping, beginning with the first contact in the spring of 2017 and moving through the payment structure and the specific instructions and the night on Route 9 and the 7 years in Dayton. The federal liaison asked precise, clarifying questions. Sandra Kraft took notes in a small notebook with a blue pen. Cassie sat across the table and listened to the story of her father's death from the man who had been its instrument and held herself steady, not by suppressing what she felt, but by understanding that what she felt was not the purpose of the room and that the room's purpose was more important than any of her immediate feelings about what she was hearing. When Walt finished, Sandra looked at everything spread across the table. The USB and the printed letter and the photographs Cassie had taken of the files on Lena's laptop before leaving Harlow, and the original deed copy from Hank's envelope, and the property notation with the buried case location, and she said, "This is more than sufficient to open a formal investigation with full federal involvement. We have had Mercer Development on our peripheral list for years without anything actionable. This is actionable in every way that matters." She looked at Cassie. "Your father built something complete." "What about Briggs?" Cassie asked. Sandra's expression was measured. He will be contacted by this office today. Given the audio recording, he will be given an opportunity to cooperate, and I expect he will take it. Men who make a decision like his once and spend the subsequent years managing the consequences of it are generally willing to cooperate when the alternative becomes sufficiently clear. He will likely tell us everything, and my mother's care arrangement. Sandra said Mercer Development has a contractual obligation to that facility. The moment we open this investigation formally, their ability to unilaterally alter that arrangement becomes legally extremely complicated. Your mother is not going anywhere. Cassie said, "What about the land?" Sandra set her pen down and looked at the property documentation Hank had laid out beside the letter. She looked at it for a long moment. "This is going to take time through the courts," she said. "I want to be honest with you. Property restitution cases move on their own calendar. But the chain of title documentation you have brought me is the most complete record I have seen in a case of this kind in 20 years of this work. Your grandfather knew what he was doing when he preserved his original deed. Your father knew what he was doing when he assembled all of this." She paused. "And you wore a bracelet for 7 years without knowing what was inside it in that unbroken chain of custody from the moment your father assembled this documentation to the morning. It arrived at this table is what makes the difference between a compelling story and a case that holds." They left the field office at 8:15. Columbus was moving at full volume around them, people going about ordinary business on an ordinary Wednesday morning, traffic in coffee shops, and the general purposeful energy of a city that had not been watching the same storm. Cassie sat in the parking lot for a moment with her eyes closed and let herself breathe. Hank sat on the hood of the truck beside her and said nothing. She had always appreciated that about him, the quality of his silences, the way he understood that presence was sometimes the entire thing a person needed, and that filling presence with words was not an improvement. After a while, she said, "He planned this in the last 2 weeks before he died." Hank said he was 41 years old and he was thinking about what his daughter would need when she was ready to use it. That is who he was. He paused. He was also impatient, which is what got him killed in the end. He had found enough to act, and he could not wait for the right moment to act. He looked at the parking lot. That was his one flaw. He always thought he could reach people. He was wrong about Briggs. "He was wrong about Briggs," Hank said. "He was right about you." Cassie opened her eyes. The sky above the parking lot was October blue and clear, the precise, bright quality of light that follows a long rain. She thought about her father at 41 being careful and patient and trusting the right people with the right pieces, not knowing with certainty whether he would survive the thing he had started. She thought he was not wrong about me. She texted Lena, "Everything is in motion. Can you hold the diner today?" Lena responded in 30 seconds, "I have been running this diner by myself before, and I will do it again. Also tell Hank that 3 different regulars asked where you were, and I told them family business, and they all said to send their regards." Harlow is strange, but it is not unkind. Cassie put her phone in her pocket. "Let's go home," she said. The retrieval team reached Marker Road at 10 in the morning when the light was clear and the ground was soft enough from the recent rain to make careful digging straightforward. 4 people from the Federal Liaison's office, plus Sandra Kraft and Hank and Cassie, and a county surveyor brought in to formally document the location for the chain of custody record. The North Oak stand was exactly as her father's letter to Hank had described it, old-growth trees along the property's northern edge that had survived the 1989 transaction because they stood on a separate parcel that had been overlooked in the process of the fraudulent transfer. The specific tree was the largest in the group, its trunk dividing at approximately 4 feet into 2 upper trunks of nearly equal size. The kind of growth that happened when a young tree sustained an injury and healed around it, growing on stronger and more structurally complex than if the injury had never occurred. A retrieval agent worked carefully at the base of the right fork with a trowel. At 18 inches, the tool met something solid. He cleared around it methodically and brought up a waterproof case sealed with a rubber gasket and a simple latch, showing no deterioration from the years it had spent in the earth. Sandra Kraft opened it with her gloves on and set its contents on the portable table the team had brought. Inside were hard copies of the email threads and financial documents that had been on the USB, printed and organized in labeled folders in the methodical way her father organized everything he intended to be used rather than merely stored. A second copy of Earl Callahan's original deed with the notary information intact and the specific irregularities her father had identified, marked with careful annotation. A small notebook in his handwriting, 64 pages, covering 3 months of documented investigation, each entry dated and specific. And a sealed envelope with Cassie's name written on it in her father's hand, smaller than the others, as if it contained less paper, but had been chosen with the same care. Sandra handed it to her without opening it. Cassie put it in her jacket pocket alongside the first letter. She opened it that evening at the diner after closing, sitting in the window booth with Lena across from her, and Hank at the counter, and the pie case humming, and the rain beginning again on Route 33. This letter was shorter. The handwriting was slightly looser, as if written when her father was less formal with himself, less in the grip of the focused urgency that characterized everything else he had written in those last weeks. He had written Cassie, "If you found this one, it means you found the others first, and you did not need this. I put it here anyway because I am your father, and I wanted one more opportunity to say the things that fathers are supposed to say, and I did not always say enough. You are going to be all right. Not because things will be easy. They will not always be easy. But because you are the kind of person who does the hard things and then keeps going, and that is the only quality that matters in the long run. Intelligence matters. Courage matters. But continuing after the hard things is what determines everything. The land is yours, and what you do with it is entirely yours. I have hopes for it, but they are not requirements, and I want you to know that. I am proud of you. I was proud of you before any of this, and I will be proud of you after, and the pride has nothing to do with outcomes. It has to do with who you are while you are trying, which has always been someone worth being proud of. Take care of your mother. Take care of Hank. Let people take care of you. Love, Dad." She read it once and folded it carefully and held it in both hands the way her mother had held the first envelope, keeping watch over something that deserved to be kept. Then she put it in her pocket with the others and picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the rain on Route 33 and let herself be in the diner without anything requiring her to act. Just present in the booth she had occupied hundreds of times in the building that smelled like coffee and old vinyl, and the warm, specific comfort of a place that had been running since 1962 and knew exactly how to do it. Lena said across the table, "Are you all right?" Cassie thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think I actually am." The news reached Harlow 2 days later, arriving not with spectacle or drama, but with the quiet procedural efficiency of investigations that have been built on solid ground. State investigators arrived simultaneously at Mercer Development's offices and the Harlow County Sheriff's Department on a Wednesday morning in the particular ordinary hour when most people in Harlow were at work or school or the diner, and the people who happened to witness the arrivals described them afterward as businesslike, which was accurate. Tom Briggs was escorted from his office voluntarily, which meant he had accepted the cooperation agreement offered, which meant he had been given the choice and had understood what refusing it would cost him. He walked out with the particular exhaustion of a man who had been managing a specific weight for 7 years and had finally decided that setting it down was worth whatever followed. Dale Mercer was at a development conference in Cleveland, scheduled as the keynote speaker for the morning session. The federal investigators arrived during registration, and he was escorted from the convention center lobby in front of a small audience of real estate professionals and municipal planners who had come to hear him speak. His attorney would later use the word theatrical to describe the location and the timing. Sandra Kraft's office would describe it as the earliest legally and logistically feasible moment for the action. He was charged initially with property fraud conspiracy and accessory to reckless homicide. The federal liaison's review of the financial documentation the USB contained uncovered additional threads suggesting that the mechanism used against Earl Callahan in 1989 and against Jimmy Callahan in 2017 had been deployed in 2 other cases across 3 decades of Harlow County property transactions, cases that had been closed as accidents or simply never investigated. Additional charges followed from those threads, with the logic of well-constructed things unfolding from their own internal structure. Cassie was at the counter when Lena showed her the first news report. She read the headline and set the phone face down on the counter and picked up the coffee pot and refilled 3 cups without being asked. The truckers whose cups she filled had no idea what had just happened, and that was fine. They needed coffee and she needed something to do with her hands, and both of those things were simultaneously true, and both of them were served by the same action. Hank came in at 3 after the lunch rush had thinned. He sat at his usual stool and wrapped his hands around his coffee mug and looked at her for a long moment. "Your father would be proud," he said. "Not yet," she said. "When it is finished." He nodded. Then after a few quiet minutes, he said, "What do you want to do with the land?" She had been thinking about it since the drive back from Columbus, turning it over in the way she turned things over, when she was in the middle of work that did not allow sustained, deliberate thought, but that her mind kept returning to in the intervals between tasks. The Marker Road parcels were frozen during the investigation and would remain frozen through the restitution proceedings, which meant nothing was being built on them for the foreseeable future. They were flat and mostly cleared the oak stand along the northern edge, preserved the county road along the southern edge, unchanged. "A community center," she said. "Practical. Workshops with real tools teaching real skills. Mechanics, leatherwork, electrical basic construction. Things people in Harlow actually need to know how to do. Space enough for people to come in and learn something that lets them take better care of their own lives." She paused. "Something named for my father, but not about him. Something the town uses." Hank turned his mug slowly in his hands, the way he did when he was thinking carefully. "Callahan's," he said. "Something people can say without it sounding like a monument," she said. "Something that just sounds like a place." He said he would have preferred that completely. The legal proceedings took 11 months. Cassie spent those months doing the things that moved at the speed of human decision rather than legal procedure, and there were enough of those things to occupy her without difficulty. She visited her mother twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays when her shifts allowed. They sat in the courtyard when the weather permitted and in the room when it did not, and they talked about ordinary things because the important things had been said in full, and ordinary things were what Ruth needed and what Cassie found she needed too. The care arrangement remained stable throughout, exactly as Sandra had said it would, and on the clear days, Ruth was entirely present and warm and funny and capable of the specific kind of comfort that only comes from someone who has known you since before you knew yourself. On one clear day in late winter, sitting in the courtyard with the bare maples overhead and a weak sun coming through them, Ruth said, "He told me once that you were going to do something hard and important someday." Not as a prediction, more as a recognition of something he could already see. She looked at the bare trees. "He said the only thing you would need from him was the pieces you could not find yourself." "He left good pieces," Cassie said. Her mother said, "So did you." Walt Greer completed his cooperation agreement and served 8 months in a minimum security facility before being released with supervised probation. He did not contact Cassie during or after, which was what she had wanted. She had said what she needed to say in the trailer in Dayton, and the rest of it was between him and however he intended to live the years he had remaining. Briggs received suspended time with full supervision and permanent revocation of his law enforcement credentials. Cassie attended one day of the proceedings, enough to satisfy herself that the record was complete, and left the rest to Sandra's team, because attending further was using something she needed for other purposes. Dale Mercer entered a guilty plea 3 weeks before the main hearing was scheduled. The sentencing covered the range of charges that had grown from the original filing, and the sentencing judge used language about the scope and duration of the documented harm that Cassie read once and did not need to read again. The land transferred back to the Callahan family in June on a Tuesday. She noticed the day when she saw it on the transfer document and thought her father would have found it appropriate. She stood at the edge of the Marker Road proper in the late afternoon light of that day, the light that turned the oak stand gold and made the cleared ground look like something that had been waiting for a specific purpose and was now ready to receive it, and felt the particular sensation of a weight whose long presence had shaped everything around it and whose removal now required everything to find a new shape. She called her mother from the property line. Ruth was fully present that afternoon and listened to Cassie's account of the transfer with the careful attention of a woman who had always known the ending but had been waiting to hear it confirmed. When Cassie finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He always said you would know what to do with it." "I had a great deal of help," Cassie said. Ruth said, "So did he." That is not the same as not knowing what to do. The chapter arrived on the first Saturday in July, 12 bikes along the fence line in the morning light. which Cassie photographed from the county road because it looked like something her father would have wanted to see, and she wanted to have the image to look at later. They were there to work, bringing the particular focused communal energy of people who understood that some things are built rather than purchased, and that building something together is its own form of commitment to the thing being built. Hank had found a contractor who had ridden with the chapter in his 20s and had since built half the substantial commercial structures in the county. The man agreed to work the project at a rate that reflected what the project was rather than the current market rate for construction, which Hank described when he told Cassie about the arrangement as the contractor understanding that some debts are paid forward. They broke ground that Saturday and worked through the fall and into winter on weekends and long Saturdays, framing and roofing and wiring, and finishing with the methodical, sustained focus of people who understood they were building something intended to outlast the immediate purpose of building it. On a Sunday afternoon in August, when the construction was far enough along to show clearly what it was going to be, Cassie drove to the facility and brought her mother to the property. Ruth stood at the edge of the cleared ground with her daughter's arm through hers and looked at the building frame and the oak stand beyond it and the open sky. "Your grandfather planted those trees," she said. "He always said they would outlast every argument anyone could make about the land they stood on." "He was right about that," Cassie said. Ruth said, "Your father used to come out here and sit under those trees when he was working through something. He said it helped him think clearly." She looked at Cassie with the steady, direct eyes of a fully present person. "He was thinking about you out here a lot of those times, about what he could leave you that would actually be worth something. Not money, though. He wanted you to have that too. Something that would help you know who you are when the hard things came." "He left the right things," Cassie said. They stood together in the August light and watched the frame going up against the sky, and after a while Ruth said, "I think this is exactly what should be done with it." He would have thought so too. The building was finished in late September, solid and practical, and designed to last in the way that good building is designed to last, without pretension or unnecessary ornamentation, but with care in every joint and decision. The main room had 12 workbenches with generous space between them, a separate storage area for materials, an office in the back, a kitchen for the volunteers who would staff the workshops, and good lighting throughout, because Cassie had been firm about the lighting and the contractor had understood why. On the first Saturday in October, the chapter gathered for the sign installation. The sign was dark walnut with raised letters finished in satin clear coat, readable from the county road in any weather, made by a woodworker in Columbus who had understood from the brief Cassie gave him that it needed to look like it had always been there. Callahan's. Below the name in letters slightly smaller, but just as clearly cut, was her father's handwriting, reproduced from the strip of leather, the 3 words he had punched into it 7 years ago, and placed inside the bracelet on his daughter's wrist for when they come. Hank stood beside the sign for a long moment. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, because the thing they were both thinking was complete and did not require words to be complete. After the gathering cleared and Lena drove home, and the aide took her mother back to the facility, Cassie went around to the back of the building where her father's Harley waited under a canvas cover in the storage bay at the east end. The chapter had spent 3 years restoring it on their own time, not according to any schedule, but according to the schedule of the work itself, sourcing original parts with the patience of men who understood that some things required exactly the time they required, and that the right pace was the one that produced the right result. It had been ready for 8 months and had been started weekly throughout that time to keep the engine honest and reliable. She pulled the cover off. The bike was chrome and black with the deep red tank that her mother had said her father chose because he believed red was the color of things that lasted. She had sat on it at 7 years old while he held the handlebars and told her that someday when she was ready, he would teach her to ride it, that you saw the world differently from a motorcycle, that there was a quality of attention the road required when nothing was between you and it, a specific directness of perception that was difficult to achieve any other way. She put on his jacket. It was wide in the shoulders and long in the arms, and settled around her with the weight of something that had been waiting for this specific moment, carrying in its old leather the smell of machine oil, and the specific memory of standing next to him in the garage, asking questions he always answered fully and without condescension. She put on the helmet, She checked the fuel and the tires and the chain the way he had taught her when she was 17 and learning on a smaller bike. Start with what you can verify, he had said. Then trust what you cannot because you have verified everything that verification was available for. She rolled the Harley out of the storage bay into the October morning. The air was cold and clear, with the precise quality that follows a long rain. Everything exact and present and distinctly itself. The field beside the new building. Bright in the low sun, the oak stand at the north edge holding the last of its leaves in shades of red and gold against a sky that was completely open. She started the engine. It caught on the second try exactly as Hank had said it would, because an engine that has been started weekly for 3 years is an honest engine, and honest engines are reliable. It sat at idle with the sound she had known since childhood, the particular note of its age and design and condition. A sound that had meant two different things when she was small, and now meant a third thing she did not have a word for, which was probably the appropriate relationship to have with something that had waited this long. She rode out onto Marker Road and turned south toward Route 33. The wind came through cold and direct, and she let it come, let the road be what it was. Under the tires, let the world be exactly as present as it was, which was more present than she had been able to let it be in a very long time. At the intersection with Route 9, she stopped. She had not planned to stop there. The turn had presented itself, and she had taken it without deciding to take it, and now she was at the junction where her father's road had ended, sitting on his motorcycle with the engine running its quiet idle in the October silence. She did not stay long. She said what she had come to say to the clear air and the empty road and the quality of light that fell on Route 9 in October and would continue to fall there every October, whether or not anyone was present to see it. She said, "I got it to the right people, Dad. I did not do it alone." She listened to the engine. "I wore it every day," she said. Then she turned north and rode back toward Harlow. She came down Main Street, past the hardware store and the library and the diner with its neon sign already beginning its early evening routine, past the county building, where a new name had been on the sheriff's door for several months, past the high school where she had spent 4 years, not knowing what she was carrying on her wrist, and out through the other side toward the open road that ran north through the county, where the fields went flat and the sky came all the way down to meet them. She rode for 20 minutes before she turned back because Harlow was where she was from, and from was not the same as finished. And she had work in the morning and a shift at the diner, and her mother to visit on Thursday, and the first community workshop to schedule for November, and all of those things were reasons to be in Harlow rather than reasons to leave it. She pulled in behind the diner and killed the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet, which was a different kind of quiet than the road. Lena came out the back door before she had pulled off the helmet. She had 2 cups of coffee, one in each hand, and the expression of someone who had been watching from the window and was making no particular effort to disguise the fact. "How was it?" Lena said. Cassie pulled off the helmet and held it in her lap. "Different," she said. "From the seat." He was right about that. She took her coffee. She thought about her father saying that every road looked different from a motorcycle, that there was a quality of attention the road required when nothing was between you and it. She thought he had been right about that the same way he had been right about most things, and that the things he had been right about had mattered more than the one thing he had been wrong about, which was whether he had enough time. They sat on the back step with the October air moving in over the lot and the sound of the diner behind them, the coffee machine and the radio at low volume, and the particular hum of the pie case and all the ordinary sounds of a place that had been running since 1962 and knew how to run and intended to keep doing it. Cassie thought about what her father had left her. Not only the USB drive inside the bracelet, not only the 38 acres on Marker Road, not only the documentation that had finally, after 30 years and 2 generations, dismantled a mechanism built on other people's loss. He had left her the chapter that picked up the phone at 1 in the morning and organized around a purpose. He had left her a mother who had kept a letter for 4 years because she did not know what else to do with it, and then remembered on exactly the right night with exactly the right clarity. He had left her a friend who was fast with her hands and present when presence was what mattered, and who was sitting beside her right now, not requiring anything to be said, which was precisely what Cassie needed. He had left her a town that was learning slowly and imperfectly, and in the particular way of small towns that have been set in their patterns for generations to do the important things in front of witnesses. He had left her the understanding that capable did not mean alone, that the people who showed up when the call came were not a resource but a community, which was not different from a family if you were paying attention to what family actually meant. She thought about the bracelet in the evidence log, empty and clean, its purpose delivered after 7 years of waiting. She touched the bare skin of her left wrist. "I need to get a new one made," she said. "Lena said I talked to Marcus about it the morning after you gave the old one to Briggs. He does leather work on Saturdays. He already said he would be honored. You talked to him the morning after." Lena said, "I had a feeling we were going to get here eventually. I did not see any reason to wait." Cassie looked at her for a moment. Then she looked out at the back lot and the line of trees at its far edge and the October sky above them. Clear and pale and completely open, the specific quality of sky that came after a long season of rain. She thought about the 3 words her father had punched into the strip of leather. "For when they come." She thought about them now, not as a warning that had been issued and answered, but as something that continued forward because the world did not stop requiring people to pay attention and show up and stay in the room when staying in the room was what was needed. The mechanism Dale Mercer had built was dismantled. The next mechanism that required dismantling would be built by someone else somewhere and would require the same things of the people who encountered it: attention, patience, the willingness to trust the right people with the right pieces, the refusal to do the important things alone. That was what the strip of leather meant in its longest form. Not a warning for a specific threat, but a description of the general condition of being a person in the world who was paying attention. They would always come in one form or another. The question was whether you were ready. She thought her father's answer to that question had been to ensure that she was. The world would not recognize the important things on its own. It moved too fast, trusted appearances over evidence, distributed authority in ways that rewarded the wrong qualities and withheld it from the right ones. It looked at leather jackets and made assumptions. It looked at careful men in dark jackets and made different assumptions. It closed cases because cases needed to be closed. It built things on foundations it did not examine because the things built on them were impressive. That was not going to change. What could change was whether specific people paid attention, whether they slowed down when something required slowing down, whether they stayed in the room, whether they trusted the right people with the right pieces, and whether those people in turn were ready when the pieces arrived. That was what people were for. Cassie finished her coffee and stood and put the helmet under her arm and opened the back door of the diner. The coffee was hot because she made sure it was. The pie case was lit. 2 truckers at the counter needed refills. A couple in the corner booth had not been in before and were looking at the menu with the slightly overwhelmed expression of people who had been driving for a long time and were grateful for a lit place to stop. She poured the coffee and greeted the new faces and took their order and moved through the room the way she had always moved through it, efficient and quiet and present in exactly the way the work required. She was 22 years old, and the land was her family's again, and the bracelet would be remade, and her mother was comfortable, and the building on Marker Road had her father's name above the door in his own handwriting. She thought that was enough for 1 October. She thought it was more than enough. Outside on Route 33, the evening traffic was building headlights, moving through the early dark, and the neon sign above Red Rock Diner had begun its nightly conversation with the parking lot, throwing red light across the wet asphalt in the long familiar streaks that rippled and reformed with each passing vehicle, and would be there again tomorrow, and the night after that, and every night the diner was open, which was every night because some things were built to last and lasted. Lena came through the kitchen door with 2 plates balanced on one arm and looked at Cassie across the counter with the expression she used when she wanted to say something and was deciding whether to say it. What Cassie said. Lena said nothing, just thinking you look like you belong here. Cassie looked at the diner, the worn tile and the patched vinyl and the lit pie case and the truckers at the counter and the new faces in the corner booth, and the rain beginning again outside on the highway, and the smell of coffee that had been the smell of this specific room for 60 years. "I do belong here," she said. She picked up the coffee pot. She went to work. Cassie Callahan had learned a specific thing about diner work that she had never heard anyone articulate clearly, but that she understood in the way you understand things that have been taught by repetition rather than explanation. The work was not primarily about food. It was about the management of transitions. People came into diners in the middle of things, between the highway and the destination, between the argument and the reconciliation, between the shift that had just ended and the one that was going to start in 3 hours. And what they needed was not only calories, but the specific comfort of a place that knew what it was and stayed that way regardless of what the people inside it were going through. The diner's job was to be constant. Cassie's job was to be the human expression of that constancy, present and attentive, and not requiring anything from the people she served beyond their order and their basic courtesy. She had become very good at this. She had become good at reading the specific quality of silence in a booth that meant someone needed to be left alone with their coffee, and the specific quality that meant they were hoping someone would ask if everything was all right. She had become good at knowing which strangers off the highway wanted to talk about where they were going and which ones needed the particular mercy of not being asked. She had become good at being useful to people who did not know they needed what she was providing them. Her father had been this way too in a different context. He had been the person people came to when they needed someone to be steady while they were not. He was not a talker in the conventional sense, not someone who filled rooms with words, but he had the quality of deep attention that made people feel that they had been heard even when he said very little in response. He had the quality of being exactly where he was at all times, which was rarer than it sounded. She thought about this some evenings when the diner had gone to its late quiet and she was doing the end of shift work, wiping down the counter, restocking the caddies, making sure the coffee was set up for the opener in the morning. She thought about what he had passed to her and what she had passed on from him without intending to, and what would pass on from her to whoever came next. That was the thing about the land too. It was not only the 38 acres or what the 38 acres represented in terms of what had been taken from the family. It was the understanding that land was not primarily an economic asset. It was a location in the world where a family had stood and worked and continued to stand and work across generations. And that continuity was its own form of meaning that did not reduce to any other kind. Earl Callahan had understood this and had refused to sell and had been killed for it. Jimmy Callahan had understood this and had documented what had been done and had trusted his daughter with the documentation and had been killed for it. And Cassie Callahan understood it and was standing on it now alive, having delivered what her father had prepared for her to deliver, watching a building go up on the ground where her grandfather had grown crops and her father had come to think when he needed to think clearly. The continuity was the point. She had not fully understood that until she stood on the property on the afternoon the transfer was confirmed and felt the specific quality of the ground under her feet, which was the same ground it had always been and was now hers in the way it had always been meant to be hers. She thought about this when the chapter was working on the building on Saturdays, watching men she had known her whole life carrying lumber and running wire and measuring angles with the focused competence of people who knew how to build things and found genuine satisfaction in the building. Hank moved among them with the ease of a man in his right place, directing without managing, contributing, without dominating the way he had always moved in the chapter, the way her father had moved in it before him. She thought about how her father had said in the letter that capable did not mean alone. He had not been talking only about the specific situation he was preparing her for. He had been talking about a general truth he had arrived at through his own life, through the years of doing things alone that should have been done with other people, through the Tuesday night when he had finally ridden to Hank's house and sat in the kitchen and said what he knew. He had been talking about the mistake he had made with Briggs, the assumption that capable and solitary were the same thing, the belief that he could protect the people he loved best by not involving them. He had been wrong about that. He had corrected it in the only way available to him, by leaving the pieces with the right people and trusting that the people who loved him would know what to do with them. She thought about Hank carrying a letter in his inside jacket pocket for 7 years starting every morning, knowing it was there, checking it periodically to make sure the tape on the seal was still holding, waiting for the moment when he would understand it was the right time to hand it over. That was its own form of fidelity, patient and sustained, and never announced, the kind of loyalty that did not require an audience. She thought about her mother sitting upright in a facility bed at 1 a.m, holding a sealed envelope with clear eyes, having kept a letter for 4 years through the progression of an illness that had taken most of her consistent memories, holding on to this one specific thing with a persistence that suggested the illness had known what mattered and had left it alone. There was something in that which Cassie did not try to explain because explanation would have diminished it. She simply received it as what it was, her mother's final act of complete presence in the story her husband had been trying to tell. The workshops began in November on the first Saturday of the month, 6 people learning basic electrical in the main room, with a retired electrician from the county who had agreed to teach the series without compensation because he said knowing how to do basic electrical was something that everyone should know, and that the lack of it cost working people money they did not have every year. Cassie sat in on the first session for an hour before her shift, watching people who had driven from 3 different parts of the county sit at the workbenches with wire and tools, and the particular focused attention of adults learning something genuinely new. And she thought that her father would have been here if he were alive and would have been good at this, the teaching and the making and the being useful to people in concrete, practical ways. She thought he would have liked the building too. The way it sat on the land, practical and solid without pretension, built to be used rather than admired. The way the oak stand was visible through the north-facing windows, those trees that had outlasted every argument about the land they stood on, as her grandfather had said they would. The way the sign above the door read simply, Callahan's a place rather than a monument, a name that meant something because of what happened inside it rather than what was inscribed on a plaque. Hank came to the first workshop session. He sat at one of the workbenches in the back and learned alongside everyone else without calling attention to his presence, which was something she noticed and appreciated. He was a man who had a great deal of standing in certain rooms and understood when the correct use of that standing was to occupy less of the room rather than more. Afterward, in the parking lot, he said to her, "Your father wanted to do this. He talked about it years before everything happened, a place where people could come and learn actual skills. He said Harlow had everything except a place that took ordinary people's practical knowledge seriously." She looked at the building. He would have built it himself, she said. He would have, Hank said. He would have done it alone and taken too long and been too proud about it. He smiled briefly. This is better. She went home that evening and sat at her kitchen table with the 4 letters from her father arranged in front of her, the one from her mother's envelope, the 3 pages from Hank's envelope, and the shorter one from the buried case. She had read them each multiple times and would read them again over the years. She had stopped carrying all of them in her jacket pocket after the first month and had put them in a box on the shelf in her bedroom where they were accessible but not in constant contact because some things needed to be taken out deliberately rather than carried always. She read the last letter again, the short one, the one that had felt like it was written by a man who had decided to say the things he had not said enough. He had written, "You are the kind of person who does the hard things and then keeps going." She thought about what the hard things had been, not only the confrontation with Dale Mercer and the night with Briggs, and the drive to Columbus at 2 in the morning, and the statement given by Walt Greer in the field office conference room. Those had been hard in specific ways that were also clarifying the kind of hardness that had a shape you could work with. The harder things had been the ones without clear shape. The 15 years of wearing the bracelet without knowing what was inside it. The 4 years of accepting Dale Mercer's generosity and not being able to name the specific thing that was wrong with it. The 7 years of growing up in a town that remembered her father fondly, and then less fondly, and then not especially the way towns processed their dead when the dead were not convenient to maintain. The years of staying when leaving would have been easier, not because staying was comfortable, but because leaving would have required closing something that was not finished. She had not known what she was waiting for. She had only known that it was not finished. Her father had been right that she would know when it was time, because she would be scared and still moving forward anyway. That was the most accurate description of what the night with the bracelet and Briggs and Hank had felt like, the specific combination of fear and momentum that she associated now with the feeling of doing the thing that was required of you rather than the thing that was comfortable. She put the letters back in the box and put the box back on the shelf and went to bed. She slept well, which was new, and woke early to a November morning that was cold and clear and entirely itself, and made coffee in her kitchen, and stood at the window and looked at the street outside, which was the same street it had been her entire life, and which she saw now with the specific clarity of someone who has finally understood what they are looking at. The street was Harlow. The diner was Harlow. The facility where her mother was comfortable and cared for was Harlow. The building on Marker Road with the sign above the door was Harlow. The chapter hall and the county road and the oak stand and the flat fields to the west and the highway running north and south through all of it were Harlow. She was Harlow in the specific way that a person becomes the place where they have chosen to stay. She had never been entirely certain that choosing to stay was the right choice. She was certain now. She drove to Red Rock and unlocked the back door and started the coffee and turned on the pie case and began the morning prep with the particular quiet satisfaction of a person who knows exactly what they are doing and why it matters. The first regular appeared at 6:45, a farmer named Harold, who had been coming in every weekday morning for 11 years and who always ordered the same thing and always left the same tip, and who had said the morning after the news about Dale Mercer broke, "Only I always wondered about that land." Said it without looking up from his coffee. Said it the way people say things they have been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down. She had poured his coffee and said, "So did my father." Harold had nodded. He had not said anything else, and she had not needed him to, and the silence between them had been the specific silence of two people in a small town who understood each other's histories without having discussed them. That was something else she was part of now. The accumulated history of Harlow, the real version of it, not the version in the county record that had been altered in specific ways by specific people for specific purposes, but the version that people carried in their memories and passed between themselves in the early morning at the counter of a diner on Route 33. The version that included her grandfather Earl, who had refused to sell, and her father Jimmy, who had documented why that refusal had gotten him killed, and her mother Ruth, who had kept a letter in a facility room for 4 years through an illness that had taken most of her consistent memories because some things the illness knew not to touch. She was part of that version now in a way she had not been before, not because her role in it had changed, but because she understood it fully for the first time. She had always been part of it. She had just not known the whole shape of what she was part of. The morning moved through its stages in the way diner mornings moved, the early quiet of the first customers, and the building hum of the breakfast rush, and the slower settling of mid-morning when the truckers had gone back to their routes and the farmers had gone back to their fields, and the counter stools had the particular look of seats that would be occupied again, but were resting for the moment. Cassie moved through it with the competence she had spent years developing, the efficiency of movement and the accuracy of attention and the specific quality of presence that made people feel that the room they were in was exactly what it was supposed to be. Lena came in at 10 for the lunch shift and looked at Cassie with the assessment she did every morning. "You slept," she said. Cassie said, "I did." "Good," Lena said, and went to get her apron. The new bracelet was ready the following Saturday. Marcus brought it to the diner at the end of his shift at the chapter hall, a small paper bag carried with the careful handling of someone who understood that the thing inside it mattered. He set it on the counter in front of Cassie and stepped back. She opened the bag. The bracelet was dark leather, similar weight and width to the original, made with the same kind of hand stitching her father had used. The clasp was silver, simple and functional. Along the inner edge, in the same hand stamp method as the original 3 words, had been pressed into the leather with the same metal stamps, each letter slightly imperfect in the specific way of letters made by hand. For when they come. She looked at Marcus. He was a man in his late 30s who had been with the chapter for 12 years and who did leather work on Saturdays in a workshop in his garage, and whose hands had the look of someone who worked with them constantly and knew what they were doing. He said, "I use the same stamps your father used. Hank has them." He said your father would have wanted the letters to look the same. Cassie held the bracelet for a moment. Then she put it on and clasped it and adjusted it on her left wrist, where it had always been, where the skin was slightly lighter from 7 years of the original sitting there. She said, "Thank you, Marcus." He nodded with the quiet dignity of a man who had done something right and did not need it amplified. He picked up his coffee and went back to his stool. She went back to work. The rain came back in the afternoon, the kind that arrived in November without announcing itself, and settled in for the long hold, steady and gray, and in no particular hurry. The highway traffic thickened in the early dark, and the neon sign came on, and the pie case hummed, and the first dinner regulars began to arrive in the familiar sequence that organized the evening. Cassie moved through it all with the leather bracelet on her wrist, new and not yet broken and not yet worn to the smoothness the original had achieved over 7 years, its stitching tight and its stamp marks sharp, and its inner edge still carrying the faint smell of fresh leather that would fade over time and be replaced by the smell of being worn and used and part of a life. She thought about what her father had meant by the three words and all the ways he might have meant them. For when they come for the truth, for when they come for the land, for when they come for what you know and what you carry, for when the people who have built their power on what was taken from other people eventually come for you the way they always do eventually, because that is the nature of what they have built. She thought he had also meant something simpler and more continuous. For when the hard things come, which they always do, for when you need to remember that you are prepared, for when you need to feel on your wrist the weight of something that was made for you by someone who knew you well enough to know what you would need. She would wear it every day. She had always worn it every day. That had not changed and was not going to change. Outside on Route 33, the rain came down in the November dark, and the neon sign threw its red light across the wet asphalt in the long, familiar streaks, and the trucks moved north and south on the highway, and the diner was lit and warm, and exactly what it had always been, a lit place to stop a constant in the middle of transitions, a room where the coffee was always hot because someone had decided that was the minimum the room owed the people inside it. Cassie Callahan moved through it with her characteristic efficiency and her characteristic attention, and the leather bracelet on her left wrist with three words pressed into it by her father's hands 7 years ago, and pressed again by another man's hands the previous Saturday, the same words in the same stamps, in the same slightly imperfect letters, a sentence that had been a preparation and was now a continuation. For when they come. She poured the coffee. She cleared the plates. She listened when listening was what was needed, and was quiet when quiet was what was needed, and was present in the room because presence was the thing the room required, and she had decided a long time ago to give the room what it required, which was not a sacrifice but a choice. And there was a significant difference between those two things that she had not always understood and now did. The diner ran the way it had always run. The highway moved outside the windows in its perpetual north and south. The pie case held what it held, and the counter stools held who they held, and the booths by the windows caught the headlights of the passing cars and turned them briefly to something else before they passed. Cassie Callahan was 22 years old. The land was her family's again. The bracelet was on her wrist. Her mother was comfortable and cared for, and occasionally entirely present in the way of a person who has not entirely left. The building on Marker Road was open and filling slowly with the kind of purpose it had been built to hold. Hank Dolan was alive and healthy and sitting at the end of the counter most evenings with his coffee and his history and his particular quality of fidelity to the people he had decided to be faithful to. She thought that was enough for one life so far. She thought it was exactly enough. She picked up the coffee pot. She went to work. There were mornings in the weeks after the building opened when Cassie drove out to Marker Road before her shift. Not for any specific reason, but because the land had become the kind of place she wanted to spend time. In the same way she had always wanted to spend time in the diner, the place where the thing that had shaped her was most fully present. She would park on the county road and walk along the fence line and look at the building and at the oak stand behind it and at the flat fields that spread east and west from the property line. And she would think about Earl Callahan farming this ground 60 years ago, and about what that work had looked like and felt like, the specific daily relationship between a person and a piece of earth that is maintained over decades. She had not known her grandfather. She had the stories her father told, which were the compressed versions that survived the deaths of the people. They are about the representative anecdotes and the characteristic qualities and the particular things he said that had seemed worth preserving. Earl had been a patient man. Her father said patient in the way of people who worked the land, who understood that the timeline of anything worth doing was longer than a single season, and that the skill was in the sustained attention across many seasons, rather than in any single dramatic intervention. He had been a man who noticed things. He had kept a journal for 40 years annotating the specific conditions of each season, the first frost and the last, the insect populations and the soil conditions, and the performance of each crop section relative to the section beside it. The journals were gone. They had probably been in the house when the house was sold and had gone with it into a disposal chain that ended in landfill. But the trees he had planted were still there. That was the specific constellation of trees, she thought. Their time scale was longer than the human time scale, and so they survived the events that did not survive, and stood in the aftermath as witnesses to the shape of what had been. The oak stand was 60 years old at minimum, more likely older. Earl had not planted them from seed. He had planted them when they were already saplings, which meant they were older than the farming era, entirely older than the Callahan connection to this specific piece of ground, older than any of the claims anyone had made on it. They had been here before any of the people whose arguments about this land had been worth dying over or killing over, and they would be here after exactly as her grandfather had said. She had taken to sitting under the largest one on the mornings when she drove out, the one with the split trunk at 4 feet that had healed around its early injury and grown on with both halves strong, the one her father had chosen as a location for the buried case because it was identifiable and permanent, and because its particular history of damage and recovery seemed appropriate to him. She would sit with her back against the right trunk and her coffee thermos open and look at the building and at the county road and at the swee above the open fields and be present in the specific way that the place made possible. The place made possible a particular kind of thinking that the diner did not make possible. The diner required and rewarded attention directed outward toward the room and the people in it and the constant small management of what the room needed. This place required and rewarded attention directed inward toward the accumulation of things she had understood over the past months and was still organizing into their final positions. She thought about her father in a way she had not been able to think about him since he died directly and without the specific grief that had always redirected her before she could look at him clearly. She thought about him as a person rather than as her father specifically, which was something that took a particular kind of distance that she had not previously had. He had been a man who paid attention, who understood the world through careful observation, and did not accept accounts of it that did not match what he had observed. He had been a man who had a strong sense of the difference between the official version of things and the actual version of things, and who found the gap between those two versions morally intolerable in a way that was probably inconvenient for him and had ultimately been fatal. He had been a man who loved people deeply and had not always told them so in the direct way, but had shown it through the specific things he prepared for them, the things he left behind that were exactly right for what they would need. She thought he had been happy in his life in the specific qualified way that people who are paying attention to the world are happy, aware of the good things around them and of the weight of the things that were not good, and choosing to be glad for the former while not ignoring the latter. He had been 41 years old and had been a father and a friend and a member of a community and had known things worth knowing and had found ways to pass them on. He had been taken early by something that did not deserve to take him, but the things he had left were still here, still operating, still producing the effects he had intended. That was not nothing. She had spent 7 years understanding it as loss, which it was, and was now beginning to understand it additionally as what he had left, which was a different kind of accounting of the same facts. The new bracelet was settling into its texture the way the original had settled over years, the leather darkening slightly at the clasp and at the places where it contacted the wrist most directly, the stitching beginning its long process of softening from the tightness of new work. She adjusted it in the mornings the way she had always adjusted the original, without thinking, the automatic gesture of attending to something that had always been there. She had told her mother about the new bracelet on a Thursday visit in late November. Ruth had been having a clear day and had asked to see it and had held Cassie's wrist in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. "He would have wanted you to have it," Ruth said. "Not just the original. He would have wanted you to have something like it always, something that reminded you of what you are carrying." "What am I carrying?" Cassie asked. Her mother looked at her with the clear eyes of a woman who had been thinking about this for a long time and had arrived at an answer she was confident of. Everything he knew, she said, about how to pay attention, about how to stay when it is hard to stay, about how the important things need witnesses and how to be one. She paused. And the knowledge that it is possible to build something that lasts longer than the person who built it, if the person builds it in the right place and trusts the right people to keep it standing. Cassie thought about that for a long time after the visit. She thought about it driving home on the county road in the November dark with the heater running and the radio low and the fields on either side of the road flat and quiet under the first light cover of frost. She thought about it opening the diner the next morning and watching the light come up over Route 33 and the first car of the day turn into the lot. Her father had built something that lasted. The documentation he assembled, the locations he chose for its pieces, the people he trusted with each piece, the words he left behind in letters sealed with tape and oilskin, in the hands of people who loved him. All of it had lasted 7 years and had arrived intact at the moment it needed to arrive. That was the building he had actually built, not the workshop on Marker Road, which was a building she had built from what he had left her. The building her father built was the thing itself, the act of seeing clearly and documenting accurately and trusting the people around him and preparing his daughter for what he understood was coming. She thought she understood now why he had not left Harlow when leaving was the safer option. He could not have built what he built anywhere else. The documentation required the specific county records. The trust required the specific people he had known for decades. The preparation required the specific context of Harlow and the specific circumstances of his family's history in it. He was not in some abstract sense the right person to do this work. He was in the specific local historical sense the only person who could have done it because the work required the combination of things he was and things he knew and people he trusted and the land under his feet, and no other location would have provided all of those in the same configuration. That was the answer to why he had stayed. And it was, she thought, at least part of the answer to why she had stayed too, though she had not understood it in those terms before. The first week of December brought the first real snow of the season, light and dry and covering Harlow with the particular muffled quiet that snow brought to small towns, dampening the sound of traffic on Route 33 and making the diner's windows steam at the edges and giving the parking lot a clean white surface that was marked by footprints within an hour of the snow stopping. Cassie drove to work through the empty early morning streets and opened the diner and started the coffee and stood for a moment in the quiet before the first customers arrived and thought about the year behind her and the year ahead. The year behind her had been the year she understood what she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. The year ahead was less defined, which was appropriate. The land was hers and the building was open and the workshops were running and her mother was stable and the case was closed in the ways that cases close, with sentences and transfers and the slow institutional processing of what had happened. The year ahead was the year of continuing, which was always the hardest year to prepare for because it did not have the same shape as the year of crisis. It required the sustained daily attention rather than the concentrated response to a specific emergency, and sustained daily attention was harder in some ways than crisis response because it did not have the clarity that crisis provided. She thought her father had understood this. He had been a man of sustained daily attention, of the long, slow work of noticing and documenting and maintaining his relationships with the people he trusted, and his crisis response when it came had been excellent precisely because it was built on the foundation of all the ordinary days that preceded it. She intended to be the same. Harold came in at 6:45 and ordered as usual and sat at his counter stool and looked at the snow on the parking lot through the window and said, "December already." December already, Cassie agreed and poured his coffee. The morning moved through its stages. The regulars came in their sequence and occupied their habitual places and said the things they said on December mornings in Harlow when the first snow had come, which were variations on the same observations about the snow and the temperature and the coming holidays that she had heard every year she had been working and that were no less welcome for being familiar. Familiarity was its own form of comfort. She had understood that since she was a child, and her father would come home at the same time every evening and hang his jacket on the same hook, and pour his coffee from the same pot, and sit in the same chair, and the repetition of those things had been a form of reassurance that required no articulation to be effective. She refilled coffees and took orders and moved through the morning with the leather bracelet on her left wrist, and her father's words pressed into it in slightly imperfect letters, in the specific quality of presence that she had worked for years to develop, and that had become over those years less a quality she worked to maintain and more simply the way she was. Hank came in at 9:30 between the breakfast rush and the lunch setup and sat at the end of the counter and accepted his coffee and looked at the snow outside with the expression of a man assessing conditions he has seen many times and knows how to read. He said the workshop had 8 people last Saturday. She said, "I know. I was there for the first hour." "The electrical instructor is talking about doing a second series in the spring," Hank said. "Plumbing, maybe." He looked at his coffee. "Your father would have done plumbing himself. He always said plumbing was the thing most people needed to know and did not know. She smiled. He said that to me once. He said the number of people who called a plumber for something they could have done themselves in 45 minutes was a failure of educational priorities. Hank smiled at his coffee. That is exactly what he would have said. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, which was something they had gotten better at over the months, the specific comfort of two people who shared a history with someone they had both lost and could sit in the presence of that history without it requiring constant management. Then Hank said, I got a call from Sandra Kraft last week. Cassie looked at him. She said the additional charges are going through as she expected. She said the full scope of the documented activity goes back further than anyone had initially estimated and that the proceedings are going to take longer than originally projected. She paused. She also said that she has been contacted by two other county attorneys in Ohio who have cases with similar patterns and are asking if the documentation your father assembled might be relevant to their investigations. Cassie set down the coffee pot. Your father documented a method, Hank said, not just one case. He documented how a specific kind of fraud is committed and what evidence it leaves and where to look for that evidence. Sandra says that documentation is more useful to property fraud investigators than just about anything she has seen in 20 years, because the people who commit this kind of fraud are systematic about it and the patterns repeat. She thought about her father at the county records office 3 times in 3 months, building his understanding from the ground up, following one thread to the next, with the patient attention of a man who trusted what he was looking at when it matched what he had observed. He would not have expected that, she said. Hank said no, he was trying to solve one specific problem. He built something that solves a general class of problem. He looked at her with the eyes that had the quality of her father's eyes. That is what capable people do when they pay attention. She looked at the snow outside the window. She thought about sustained daily attention and what it built over time when it was directed at the right things. She thought about her grandfather's journals, the 40 years of careful observation that had been lost to a disposal chain, but that had shaped the man who kept them and had shaped through him the man his son became and the woman that son's daughter was in the process of becoming. She thought about the oak stand on Marker Road, older than any of the human arguments about the ground it stood on, present as a witness to all of it, continuing to grow. She thought, pay attention, not just to what you are doing, to everything around you at the same time. She thought that is what he was teaching me, from the beginning, every time. She picked up the coffee pot. She went back to work. Outside, the December snow on Route 33 was already being compressed by the tires of the morning traffic into the gray slush of a road that was used regardless of weather, because the road was the road and the work was the work, and the people who drove it had places to be and things to do and were going to do them. Red Rock Diner stood at the junction of Route 33 and Callaway Road and had been standing there since 1962 and was going to keep standing there, lit and warm and smelling like coffee, with the pie case hummed and the counter stools occupied by people who needed exactly what it provided. And Cassie Callahan was going to keep being the person who provided it, with the leather bracelet on her wrist and her father's words pressed into it in slightly imperfect letters, and the specific quality of attention he had taught her before she was old enough to understand that it was being taught. She was 22 years old. The year ahead was open. The land was hers. The bracelet was new and would not always be new, and that was exactly right. She picked up the coffee pot and went to work. The thing about staying in a place for 22 years was that you eventually knew it the way you knew the inside of a room you had lived in long enough to navigate in total darkness. You knew where the furniture was, and you knew where the walls were, and you knew the particular quality of silence at 3 in the morning and the particular quality of sound at 7 on a weekday when the town was waking up. You knew which streets were going to be icy first in November and which ones dried fastest after spring rain. You knew who was going through something difficult without needing to be told, because you had watched them long enough to know what they looked like when they were fine and could identify the departure from that baseline. Cassie had been 22 years old her whole life in this town, which was to say she had been growing up in it from the beginning, and the growing up had not stopped at any particular point and was not stopping now. She was different from the person she had been in September than she had been in the previous September, and different again from the person she would be in the September after this one. That was not a problem. That was the correct relationship to have with yourself when you were paying attention and the world was giving you things worth paying attention to. She thought about this on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December when she drove to the facility for her weekly visit and found her mother in the courtyard, despite the cold, sitting on the bench with her cardigan and a blanket across her lap and her face lifted toward the pale winter sun with the particular quality of someone who has decided that a small good thing is worth the discomfort of the cold required to access it. Cassie sat beside her and accepted half the blanket, and they sat in the winter courtyard together and looked at the bare maples and the empty bird feeder and the dormant flower bed and the quality of light that came through the branches of the trees in December, thinner and more direct than summer light, doing more with less. Her mother was in a middling state that day, not the full clarity, but not the deep confusion either, a kind of careful present tense engagement with what was immediately in front of her, which was Cassie and the courtyard and the cold sun and the bare trees. It was a version of her mother that Cassie had come to appreciate in its own right, not as a lesser version of the clear days, but as its own kind of presence, quieter and more immediate and less concerned with the architecture of memory. Ruth said after a while, "Your father used to say that winter was the honest season." Cassie looked at the trees. "Why honest?" she asked. "Because it shows you the structure," her mother said. "Summer covers everything in green, and you think the green is the important part. Winter takes it all away, and you see the actual shapes, the bones of things." She looked at the trees. He thought that was valuable, seeing the bones. Cassie looked at the branches against the pale sky. She thought about the bones of the story she had been living inside for the past year, the structure of it, stripped of the green of not knowing the actual shape of what her family had been doing in Harlow for 3 generations, the actual shape of what had been done to them and what they had done in response. She thought the bones were strong. She thought the bones were exactly what they should have been. She said, "He was right about that." "He was right about most things," Ruth said again, the phrase she had used before, and would probably use again because it was true and because the things that are true bear repeating. "He was wrong about one." She looked at Cassie sideways with the gentle directness of a woman who had been thinking about this for a long time and was willing to say it plainly. "He thought he had to protect us by keeping things from us. He thought the weight was his to carry alone." Cassie said, "He corrected that, in the end." Ruth said, "In the end he did." She looked at the empty bird feeder. "I sometimes think about what it would have been like if he had trusted me sooner. If he had come home that Tuesday and sat at the kitchen table and told me all of it, instead of going to Hank's house and then coming home and being quiet about it." She paused. "I would have been afraid. I would have wanted him to stop." She paused again. "But I would have known. And knowing together is different from knowing alone." Cassie thought about that for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening shift and through the closing work and on the drive home through the December dark. She thought about it in the way she thought about things that had not finished resolving, turning it over and looking at it from different angles without forcing it to a conclusion. Knowing together is different from knowing alone. Her father had known something and had carried it in a specific way, which was carefully and alone protecting the people he loved from the weight of it by taking the weight himself, and the result had been that he died with the weight still on him, having passed it forward in pieces to the people who could use those pieces after he was gone. That was a kind of love. It was not the only kind. She thought about the version of the story where he had come home on a Tuesday and sat at the kitchen table and told her mother everything, and where her mother had been afraid and had wanted him to stop, and where he had not stopped, because stopping would have left the mechanism in place for the next person who refused to sell. She thought about the version where they had gone through it together, where the fear was shared and the weight was shared and the preparation was shared, where Ruth Callahan had known the whole shape of what her husband was doing and why, and had chosen to stand with it rather than having it carried away from her and returned to her years later as a sealed envelope held in trembling hands in a facility bed. She thought he should have trusted her. She also thought he did the best he could with what he knew about love and protection at 41 years old. And the best he could produced a set of documentation that was dismantling a 30-year fraud in multiple counties. And the people he trusted with the pieces he prepared carried them correctly, and his daughter was alive, and the land was hers, and his name was above the door of a building that was teaching people the practical skills they needed to take care of their own lives. Both of those things were true at the same time, which was usually the case with the complicated parts of love. She thought about the new bracelet on her wrist and about the specific choice it represented, which was not only the choice to continue carrying what had been prepared for her, but the choice to do it differently from how her father had done it, to do it in front of witnesses, to do the important things in the company of the people she trusted rather than away from them, to let the people who loved her know the shape of what she was carrying so that they could stand with it too. That was what her mother had said without knowing she was saying it. Knowing together is different from knowing alone. She was going to remember that. She was going to let it change the way she moved through the things ahead of her, which would have their own hard places and their own preparations, in their own moments of looking at the bones of things in the winter light and understanding the actual structure. She was going to do it in front of witnesses. She pulled into her parking spot and turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet with the December cold coming through the glass and the bracelet warm on her wrist from the heat of the car. And she thought that she was 22 years old and had already understood more than most people understood by twice her age. Not because she was exceptional, but because she had paid attention and because the people who loved her had trusted her with real things. And that combination of attention and trust was what produced the kind of knowledge that mattered. She thought her father had been right. She thought she was going to be all right. She got out of the car and went inside.